Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Wilson Center Africa program, I'd like to welcome you all to today's discussion of former child soldier reintegration in Uganda, lessons learned from Africa and the way forward. My name is Hannah Beckett, and I'm the program associate here at the Wilson Center's Africa program. So first of all, I'd like to welcome all of you guests here today, including members of the diplomatic, governmental, and NGO communities, and members of the press. We're happy you're here today. I would also like to welcome you, those of you who are watching online via the webcast and following on Twitter. You can follow the live tweets of today's event at the Africa Program's Twitter account at AfricaUpClose and contribute to the discussion using the hashtag #ChildSoldiers, which is all one word. If you have a question during the Q&A section of the event, you can also tweet them to the account using that hashtag. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Wilson Center, it was chartered by Congress in 1968 as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson to commemorate his ideals and concerns. As the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum, the Wilson Center seeks to provide a space for inclusive dialogue and analysis to better inform policy debates on pressing global issues. The Wilson Center follows events on the ground in Africa very closely and strives to address key issues impacting Africa and U.S.-Africa relations. It seeks to be the leading institution for in-depth research and dialogue by bringing the voices and perspectives of African scholars, practitioners, and leaders, both public and private, to bear on these issues. The reintegration of former child soldiers is a pressing issue globally, including for African governments, communities, and international partners. And it's one that speaks to wider conflict prevention and peace-building goals on the continent. The UN's latest report lists 14 countries actively using child soldiers, 7 of which are in Africa. According to Human Rights Watch, Somalia and Nigeria, among other countries globally, saw increases in child soldier recruitment in 2017. However, efforts to eliminate the prevalence of child soldiers also continue. In 2017, the Democratic Republic of Congo's armed forces were removed from the UN's list of shame for child recruitment, and 5,700 child soldiers were released in the Central African Republic and the Philippines. Nevertheless, work remains. So as efforts to end conflicts are ongoing, today's discussion really plays a key role in evaluating the next steps after release. Returned child soldiers face a myriad of challenges, including social stigma, economic and political exclusion, lack of work training, and physical and mental health challenges. The successful reintegration of children affected by conflict is essential for establishing the conditions for lasting peace and stability. The Lord's Resistance Army is one particular rebel group that's notorious for its use of child soldiers. And while the LRA's presence in Uganda has been decreasing, it does remain active in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic. At one point, the UN estimated that about 90% of LRA soldiers were minors, and between 30 and 60,000 children have been abducted by the LRA in Uganda since the 1980s. LRA fighting has had a disproportionate impact on children and families, causing mass displacement and disruptions to education and healthcare. While many governments, international NGOs, and international organizations like UNICEF have been involved in quelling the violence and returning child soldiers to their homes, some major roadblocks to progress still persist. These roadblocks include the prevalence of top-down approaches, the social and economic alienation of returned soldiers, the need for continued evaluative research on reintegration strategies, and the siloing of broader peace-building, development, and conflict mitigation efforts. So today's event will seek to parse out those challenges. It's going to look at ongoing efforts and offer key lessons learned and policy options for the way forward for Uganda and other parts of the continent. To facilitate today's discussion, we're joined by several distinguished and knowledgeable speakers. And you can find their complete bios in the event handout, but I'd like to introduce them today in the order in which they're speaking. So first we have Ms. Chidi Blyden-Rowe. She's the former director for East Africa at the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the former director of the Africa program at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. She's going to use her expertise to provide an overview of key efforts and challenges of reintegrating child soldiers, and also offer some policy options for the way forward. Our second speaker, Mr. Sasha Lezhnev, is the founding director of the Grassroots Reconciliation Group and the deputy director of policy at the Enough Project. He will address shortcomings of current approaches to reintegration and offer best practices for furthering holistic, inclusive, and effective programming. And finally, Dr. Jamie Van Leeuwen is a former Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow and the founder and CEO of the Global Livingston Institute. He will share his research from northern Uganda and offer practical recommendations for workforce training and community reintegration. So with that, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our first speaker, Ms. Chidi Blyden-Rowe.
Thank you, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center, particularly the Africa program, for inviting me to participate in this discussion today. For the context of my remarks, as Haley mentioned, I've been asked to speak on the key efforts of reintegrating child soldiers into communities, some of the challenges and lessons learned in this process, and also been asked to provide a few recommendations on how to improve efforts for effective reintegration. A quick caveat that my remarks are representative of my thoughts and the work that I've done from the U.S. government, NGOs, in conflict mediation, and from my personal research and studies on African security issues through a conflict lens with a geographic focus on Africa. So I'd like to start with just maybe thinking about some of the nuance of who are considered child soldiers. What does it mean to be a child soldier in today's conflicts and wars? I think traditional ideas around child soldiers often have us thinking about cases in Liberia or Sierra Leone or even Uganda, which we'll talk about today, where children are conscripted or forced to fight alongside adults. But I think we're also having to think now about the growing trend of violent extremism and how children are being used in today's wars. For example, in Nigeria, children are being kidnapped and forced to serve as suicide bombers and are basically born into being fighters, as we're seeing from the trend of Boko Haram's scourge in the northeast of Nigeria. We also see youth militia playing a more prominent role in political violence, for example, in Bonaire in Burundi, as personal security forces for political leaders. And I mention this because I think it's important to try and note these various types of activities that children are involved in when it comes to war, because it has an effect on how you shape their reintegration process. Having an understanding of their experience and the trauma, I think, will definitely help in the rehabilitation process and their needs coming out of conflict. The process of reintegration and welcoming back child soldiers or ex-combatants into communities is a necessary step in peace building and conflict resolution process. Reintegrating children can be a very delicate undertaking, as they are always, in my opinion, the victims of the conflict. It is important for all parties, both the child, the youth, and the community, to be open to and ready for reintegration. I think this can only be done once various parties to the conflict have been recognized, their voices and grievances have been heard, and they feel that they have or will receive justice in the process. The ability for society to return to normalcy after a traumatic experience is an indicator of whether or not conflict has transformed itself or has come to a close. I think likewise for reintegrating children, returning to normalcy as best as possible is also a crucial part of the healing cycle. This step can help indicate that both parties are ready to move forward as well. So with that, I'd like to just frame some of the challenges of reintegration in a way that perhaps highlights what needs to occur to increase chances of success for reintegration, rather than thinking of them as challenges. As we know, reintegration happens over a long period of time and can be successful when it has a few of the following elements under consideration and for things that are in place. I'd start with a formal disarmament and demobilization process. I think many countries come out of conflict and are just trying to grapple with getting the country back on track. Particularly in Africa, we see that government institutions tend to be weak and don't always have public services that are responsible for human welfare and child services. We tend to find that these are either limited or non-existent. I think most people understand that current practice for DDR is to be led by the United Nations, but not every country has a UN presence. And I would argue that even the UN process itself has its own challenges. I think, for example, in Nigeria, when military or civilian joint forces find child soldiers, there's limited information on what to do with the children, where to take them, And so we see that they create ad hoc mechanisms to manage these children. We've seen examples of mass detainments where children are lumped in with adults into jails. They don't have a judicial process that they go through, or they're prematurely returned to villages without going through a formal reintegration process. I think the growing number of ex-combatants, child soldiers, and defectors that will need to be reintegrated coming out of the various conflicts on the continent will cause us to have to start looking at alternative approaches to managing reintegration outside of just multilateral organizations. I think the work that several NGOs are doing, local organizations are doing, are been very helpful and provide an alternative. I think, but there needs to be better coordination on these efforts to ensure that the children receive the services that they need. Next, I would maybe touch on community sensitization. Communities, likewise, suffer during conflicts, and it's imperative, I think, that communities be aware and are part of the reintegration process. Ex-combatants may have a history with particular communities, and it's essential that buy-in from the community is part of the rehabilitation and reconciliation process. Another, I think, necessary component of reintegration is tracing families and family mediation. It's not common that children will be able to be immediately returned to their families. Services that will help reunite families and support their reintegration process are also key to be in place before this process begins. In other instances, follow-up after a return to a family or community and having extended monitoring of those children once they've been placed back with the family is also essential. For children who are not placed with their parents or their immediate family, this is even more essential as they tend to have a higher rate of return to going back to activities that they're more familiar with, or in other words, returning back to being a child soldier, something that they're more common and familiar with. I think taking note of traditional practices, cleansing ceremonies, traditional healing, and finding religious support depending on the type of conflict or the type of child soldier that is being reintegrated is also extremely important. This can help lead to, again, curbing the urge to return to being a child soldier, as well as providing a local sort of feel to the reintegration process. Making sure that there's access to school or skills training, adequate quality of programs, which my colleague will talk about, to increase literacy and numeracy instruction, the provision of tools, materials, again, education and training also can help the reintegration process go a little bit better. Other things to consider are ongoing access to healthcare, particularly for war-related conditions. Young people tend to have different issues as issues vary between girls and boys as well when you talk about health and human services being available to be able to deal with some of the challenges that come out of having children being a part of war. And then lastly, maybe for some of the challenges, I'll talk maybe just a little bit about how I think gender considerations when reintegrating child soldiers can be extremely important to the process and to ensure success. We already know that boys and girls experience conflict and trauma and war very differently. I think the same consideration needs to be taken for understanding how gender affects reintegration. For example, stigmas that are attached to women and girls who return from conflicts as wives of ex-combatants or soldiers, or even pregnancies, can stifle hopes of successfully reintegrating depending on the community. Girls or boys who have been raped during conflict are often ostracized or dispelled from communities depending on different community myths, and often could cause children to, again, want to return to being child soldiers or going back to familiar contexts that they know. I think to alleviate some of the challenges of reintegrating children back into society, we've learned that establishing youth groups, clubs, sports activities, helping improve literacy, have all helped the reintegration process. Even just ensuring that these children have a place to go on a daily basis, whether it be school or community center, has improved their chances of fully reintegrating back into society and not returning to the life of a child soldier. I think another key point, and I'll try to wrap up my comments here, is to note is that the role of the local communities, governments, local civil society, and government actors can really promote a positive image and foster better rehabilitation processes. For example, in Algeria, as part of the reintegration process of former AQIM soldiers, local religious and community leaders or imams or other trusted leaders in the community lead mediation efforts and help youth understand their trauma as a part of the community process. Community members often have the power to be able to bring communities and ex-combatants together, unlike governments, and have that influence to help push the process beyond maybe what it would initially go to if it's something that's mandated from the top down from a government, from an outside institution or a multilateral organization. So I think with that, I'll maybe turn to a couple of key efforts that have been done by governments, organizations, before turning over to talk maybe more specifically about the programming. Many multilateral organizations, including the U.S. government, don't have a uniform policy or approach to how they manage relationships with countries who have used child soldiers during conflicts. Instead, I think they depend on either their agency outlook or cross-cutting issues, diplomatic relationships, and how they manage that. And they tend to do maybe what you would call a patch approach, that are either preventative measures or sometimes maybe even punitive measures, depending on how you look at it, to try and enforce their position or the use of their position on the use of child soldiers. In the United States, there's the Child Soldier Protection Act that was enacted. There's also the Trafficking in Persons report that comes out annually that speaks to human rights issues, child protection soldier issues, to ensure that countries are not overtly using child soldiers as part of their wars. I think while these have been successful in the past, because they can diminish or reduce the relationship that countries have with a particular government or with an organization, they're not going the full measure to really curb, I think, the use of child soldiers, as it tends to still be a go-to for a lot of governments and countries. I think that the majority of reintegration efforts that have been done, from my experience, have been preventative. You'll see a lot of programming from USAID. You'll see a lot of programming from the UN that tend to speak to trying to get out ahead of having children recruited for child soldier activities by trying to create outlets or opportunities for them to have opportunities outside of being forced to become child soldiers. And then lastly, since I'm running short on time, let me just wrap up by providing a couple of measures a couple of concrete measures on how I think that child reintegration could be improved. Having worked in the government and on policies of this nature and with an NGO, I think that there could be more local and established DDR programs that are coordinated and designed to run within particular countries, taking into consideration the culture, the norms, and protocols understood by the community to allow for a better reintegration. I think that we need to consider whether the communities, local or federal, or institutions have infrastructure that are ready to accept and care for child soldiers or ex-combatants into society. For example, are judicial and legal systems designed or amended to deal with youth? I think we saw the example of Dominic Ongwen, who was the number 2 in the LRA, and how his case was forwarded to the ICC. But there were a lot of questions about whether or not he should be tried as an adult, seeing as he was taken into the LRA as a young youth at the age of, I think, either 9 or 10 or something like that. So how do you try cases like that, and our judicial system set up to be able to deal with that? And then lastly, I think improved or increased efforts on the preventative side, continued programming that helps address some of the failures of countries, their governments and institutions that are underdeveloped, because I think it's the lack or limited opportunities for education in youth that often lead them to either being kidnapped or either being conscripted as child soldiers as a way of getting money or the way of having something to do. So wrapping that up really quickly, I will turn to Mr. Sasha to talk about more specific programming.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Great. Push anything, or is it? Oh, it's working already. Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Chidi, and thanks a lot to Dr. Mwango Muyangwa and Hannah for organizing this panel and having me on it. The Wilson Center always brings a lot of fond memories to myself. Howard Wolpe, who was your former director, was a mentor of mine. One of the first panels I ever did was here launching my book, and Howard was the moderator. So always a pleasure to be here. I founded the Grassroots Reconciliation Group 11 years ago, and basically we run projects to help reintegrate former child soldiers, and not all of them are children. We say formerly abducted people in northern Uganda. Been running them since 2007. We actually started as part of a USAID funded project in 2005, so even longer than that. Since then, we've helped reintegrate about 1,400 of them in northern Uganda. We run 5 different types of projects. The majority of our participants are actually women, to many people's surprise. The 5 projects are microfinance, livelihoods, trauma support, reconciliation, and community theater. So on the microfinance side, we do a lot of savings and loan, and actually it's oftentimes just bringing people up to the point where they can actually engage with a microfinance institution, because a lot of them don't have any savings at all. So just trying to build that up. On the livelihood side, which has largely been demand-driven, we've done a lot of group farming projects, a lot of animal husbandry projects, learned a lot of lessons on how to raise animals. That's been interesting. Done a lot of small business training, and so we deliberately don't do education support because our decision, and this was based on the community input, was to say, well, you can use the income from those projects to actually help send your kids to school. And so we don't even count anymore, but it's in the thousands of kids who have gone to school because of the income from the projects. For the trauma support, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but there's a variety of things. It's, again, sort of driven by the demands of the community. So some of it's individual counseling, some of it's referring to actual psychiatrists. There is one in northern Uganda, so psychiatrist. Some group therapy, and over the last year we've been training peer counselors. And on the reconciliation side, doing a lot of cleansing rituals, and then the community theater stuff, and our budget is roughly $50,000 to $60,000 a year. Anyway, just to give that small introduction, I really want to focus on some of the lessons that we've learned, and also some of the lessons that caused us to come into existence in the first place. I lived and worked in northern Uganda for almost 3 years, and thankfully did not have to run any real projects on the ground. Our whole aim as part of this USAID program was to engage in what we called structured or community dialogues between all kinds of different people, mostly in northern Uganda. We did some southern or central Uganda and northern Uganda dialogues as well, which was interesting, but with youth and elders and all kinds of things. But what I was able to observe from other programs, as well as hear from the members of the communities themselves on their feedback on various NGO activities on the ground. And I do say NGO activities because the government of Uganda has not really engaged in this process, I think, even to date. So I'll share 3 main lessons from our programming and some of those other programs that I think are applicable to other contexts. So first of all, the first one is to not stigmatize child soldiers further, and deliberately make any reintegration programs very inclusive. I saw firsthand how stigma was a very, very real issue, despite the fact that child soldiers in Uganda are almost all abducted against their will, which is not necessarily the case in other countries. Nevertheless, when they return, when they escape, barely in many cases, they are still called crazy, called rebels, and shunned from social activities, from school, from creating joint business ventures with local communities, which I personally found pretty shocking. Right, if you were abducted or kidnapped from your home and then forced to do all these things, and you come back and you have nothing, And then everyone, and you're finally home. You're like, great, hey everybody, and then boom, they're like, get away, you're crazy, you're a killer, blah blah blah. And I saw NGOs firsthand who were, got a grant to focus on child soldiers only or child mothers or some specific project. Stigmatize these people even further. So, like one example was, they handed out T-shirts that said former child soldier in the local language on the back. And so as soon as and these people didn't have a lot of clothing. This is during the active war in northern Uganda. So it was blatantly obvious when they came back to their communities that, who they were. And they often previously tried to hide that. So that's one silly example, but a real one. So in our programs, we have deliberately tried to have at least some membership from both people who were abducted as well as other people in the community. And to be fair, the survivors of conflict who are not former child soldiers, they face immense problems just as well, right? I mean, these are the husbands, the wives, the children, the parents of the people who were abducted or who were affected or killed, and they have many, many issues of their own. The inclusivity of projects like that helps them heal, right? And of course, and we help them lay down ground rules, like you're not allowed to call people names, at least when you're in our group, right? Or if you see someone else do it, you have to intervene, and that kind of thing. So we think that kind of thing helps. Number two is that the psychological scars of abduction and kidnapping and child soldiering certainly do not heal overnight. And this is something that's been very interesting in our projects. We've been present in northern Uganda for, basically a decade since there's been active armed conflict on the ground, right? And so we thought 5 or 6 years into that process, when almost everyone had returned home from the IDP camps, that, actually most people would be more interested in conducting business or farming or that kind of thing. And yet we did a needs assessment, which actually identified that most people thought that their psychological trauma issues were ranked at the top of the list of the issues that were important to them. And we thought that was very interesting and surprised me. And we started a whole trauma support project in all of our areas based on that. And so just because there's not active conflict going on at the moment, just because the economy is developing, does not mean that those psychological or psychosocial issues do not mean to be dealt with. And so we do group therapy and peer counselors and all that kind of thing. And then the last lesson I would point to was basically that there's major downsides in doing sort of one-off trainings or one-off projects. So I saw a lot of this when we were in northern Uganda, that there were groups of people doing sensitizations. That was a very popular term. I'm sure it's popular in other areas. And so they would go to one area and bring, some former child soldier and some local community member, and they would hug. And I mean, it was more than that, obviously. But anyway, the point is that they were just one-off things in these communities. And so we've learned that patiently working with groups on a very regular basis, particularly with people who are quite traumatized, is very important and helps them slowly build up the confidence needed to engage in business, to enter the workforce, to go back to school. In our groups that they work together for up to 5 years. And the membership changes sometimes, but the group's structured like that. I'm going to transfer, since I wear another hat as well, as Hannah said, I work at the Enough Project, which works on policy. So just for 1 minute to say a few words about kind of policies looking at child soldiers apart from programming. The armed groups, and they largely are armed groups. There are some armies that you both identified who still use child soldiers. They in many cases are generating revenues and profits from their from their activities. In the case of the LRA, they've generated money from ivory, gold, and diamonds. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is what I mostly focus on at Enough, they generate a lot of money from minerals and gold, other taxes from communities, and so if we want to look at the causes of child soldiering and how can we, as a policy community, have an impact on that, I think it's very important to focus on that financing element, and I'll just mention the names of some of these things. We can talk about them more in the Q&A perhaps. So of some policy initiatives to try to work to address those. So one is targeted sanctions against the networks of these armed groups, and also the people or countries that support them. Whether they be smugglers themselves, whether they be the commanders of the armed groups, or perhaps international businessmen that facilitate those. The Global Magnitsky sanctions issued last December are a great example of how you can sanction all elements of that chain. Clamping down on smuggling efforts in either capitals or neighboring countries. We put out a report last year which discussed the role of Uganda in Kampala in particular, Kampala and Entebbe, in the illegal ivory trafficking. So there's not a lot of ivory being poached in Uganda, but they certainly are a major trafficking route from Congo and other countries. Certainly prosecutions of people who use child soldiers and the people that protect them, and there's been some progress on that. And also private actions by companies, right? So companies consume a lot of these products, so not ivory, but gold, diamonds, minerals, and so the efforts by companies can make a difference on there. So thanks a lot. And with that, Jamie.
Great.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I've finished my Wilson Fellowship, and I'm going to prove to Dr. Muyangwe and Hannah that I've earned my keep in the East Africa program here. And part of the fun of being at the Wilson Center is you get to meet and be around people who are a lot smarter than you. And so I have a great team. Michael Feinberg's in the audience today, who helped me with a lot of the research that I did over the course of the fellowship. And actually I have quite a few colleagues from Uganda. Ryan Grundy, who's our executive director, and our team from Uganda that's probably sleeping right now, so they'll tune in tomorrow to see if I said it right. But I'm really excited about kind of building off of this and building on the conversation that's happening. I think that the most important thing that we can do in terms of addressing the child soldier enigma that we're dealing with is to talk about it. And it's been definitely something that the Global Livingston Institute took on as part of our research portfolio. And so just a little bit of background on the Global Livingston Institute. I play two hats. My day job is serving as the senior advisor to Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado. And then unrelated to that, I'm the CEO and founder of the Global Livingston Institute. And we've been around for about 10 years. I describe us as a poor man's Aspen Institute, that we built ourselves around being a place that instead of a place for CEOs and heads of state and philanthropists to come, we wanted a place for teachers and musicians and artists and students and community leaders to come to solve complex social issues. We're based in Uganda. And our platform is really around looking at all of the nonprofits that have kind of descended in our developing countries to fix things and really encourage them to listen and think before they act, and to have these kind of conversations and to get to know community before you go and build a school or you build a medical clinic. And contradicting that notion of don't just do something, stand there, and getting people to think a little bit more before we do things. And as part of the Global Livingston Institute, we've really focused on investing in local communities. We're 75% Ugandan run. We have a team of about 40 Ugandans who have really guided these efforts. And we have about 10 academic partnerships that we've developed over the last 10 years since we started the Research Institute. And one of those partnerships was really to look at in northern Uganda, what was happening with the former child soldiers. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper on some of the issues that Chidi and Sasha touched on. So we have kind of that range of who are the child soldiers and then what's happening in some of these communities and the impact that they're having, the impact that their transition is having on those communities. And we identified an academic partner in Cornell, and Dr. Miller and a team of her students came together from the Cornell Institute of Public Affairs and said, let's look at the child soldier issue, not from a standpoint of how can we help them or how can we fix things, but let's understand what's happening in one of these communities. And a lot had been written on what happens to the child soldiers when they're in the bush and all the bad things that happen to them when they're out in the being child soldiers. But what happens to them 5 years after they're home? And what do those communities look like, and how are they reintegrating the community, and what do they do as they're returning home? And I think that my colleagues have touched on it to some degree, actually to a broad degree. When we went to Leeuwen and we connected with the Rakeli Rehabilitation Center, which is one of the centers that was developed to respond to the child soldiers who were returning to the communities. We had a great base because they had access to all of these young people that had kind of grown up at the center. And to give you a geographic perspective, Sasha was referring to Gulu. Both Gulu and Leeuwen are in the northern part of Uganda, for those of you not as familiar with the region, and just south of the South Sudanese border. And so as these child soldiers were relinquished by Joseph Kony as he moved into the South Sudan, they started returning to their community. And it was a fascinating issue. It was one of the first issues that the Global Livingston Institute took on, and it was one that was personally of interest to me, having spent about 2 decades of my career working on a domestic issue on homelessness and knowing how hard it is to get a homeless person back into their community. How do you do that with a child soldier? You're talking about a 10 or a 12-year-old that's been abducted from some of the safest places that you could imagine, your school, your grandmother's house, your church, and then they were taught to kill, and they were taught to harm their communities, and they were taught to do awful things to their community. And then all of a sudden, after they've done all those things, we've got to figure out how do you return them back to those communities and rehabilitate. And so I was very curious about that, and Cornell ended up being a great partner for us. And over the last 3 years, we've done a series of research efforts around that. And one of them, it was kind of the culmination of the work that I did as part of my Wilson Fellowship. And we took a group of former child soldiers that we drew from the Children of Peace, Uganda, and the Rakeli Rehabilitation Center. And I do want to reiterate a point that's been made by my colleagues about how important these issues are in terms of making them locally owned. That any of the research we did, we didn't drive the research. We really partnered with the community to help them drive the research. We have a colleague named Jane who runs Children of Peace, who really helped us conduct these in-depth qualitative interviews, and they were the driving force behind that. And Cornell and the Global Livingston Institute really helped guide that as we moved it forward. Our first sample of qualitative interviews was about 3/4 male, and about 1/3 of those subjects reported having been married. I'm going to go through a little bit of data around this just to kind of characterize a subset of this, and not to generalize, but to go specifically to what we saw in Leeuwen. Average education was under 9 years of schooling, and a majority of the sample reported being either poor or fair health, which is a lot of what Sasha was talking about in terms of the psychological impact that child soldiering will have on a young person. Almost half of those who were interviewed perceived that they were unwelcome in their communities, and all of the subjects identified job training and skills as a necessary resource above healthcare to reintegrate back into their communities. And so we started looking at that needs assessment as well. And I think that some of your data will probably not necessarily be the same in one community over another, depending on how accessible employment opportunities are, how accessible workforce development and job training is, in terms of where they prioritize the needs. In Leeuwen, the ability to move into the workforce is almost non-existent because jobs in Leeuwen are almost non-existent. The profile of the former child soldiers in Leeuwen, coupled with the existing research on former child soldiers in other communities, would suggest a lot of what Chidi was talking about is taking a more holistic approach in order for rehabilitation to be successful in communities such as Leeuwen. The other thing that definitely resonated with us, and I want to reiterate, is that tendency to focus on one specific community that's been disenfranchised. The best way to make them feel more disenfranchised is to only provide that community with services. And so if you're going to go in and provide health care and workforce development training, if the only people who benefit from it are the former child soldiers, you will annoy the rest of the community even more than they might already be. And then currently we're working, we're very fortunate to have a long-term longitudinal partnership with Cornell to really look at how do we better understand the community, not just from the lens of the former child soldiers, but one of the areas where Dr. Miller and her team have really turned the lens now is to really look at what are the community's perceptions of that. And when we start talking to the employers and the teachers and the service providers in the community, what is their take in terms of what it means to have them back in the community? Our former child soldiers are saying that there's a perception of feeling unwelcome. Is that perception shared by the community that we're working in? And then, one of the things I really appreciate about Hannah and Mondi and the approach that the Africa policy arm takes is really looking at better understanding the issues, but then, so what does that mean? And what do those solutions look like? And in the true spirit, I always talk about listen, think, and act. I've worked in government for a long time, so there's a lot of people who listen and they think, and they listen and they think, and then they write a plan. And then the plan gets outdated, so you go and you listen and you think some more. So you can't just do that piece, you have to act. And then we have an NGO community sometimes that tends to do the action part without doing any of the listening and thinking first. And I think you have to do both of those. And as we start looking at the solution base, one of the things that the Global Livingston Institute has really started to develop is our workforce development arm and our social impact arm. So about 3 years ago, we added a for-profit social impact arm that's all focused on workforce development and training and putting people back into the workplace. And I think that our approach in terms of training Ugandans in basic skills in Kampala, we're really focused on workforce development around hospitality and basic management skills. As we grow and as we develop this research out of Lyra, the area that we're really turning our focus to is agriculture. And over the next year, we have a workforce development grant that will allow us to focus on the training and the workforce development training. But you've got to make sure that when you do that workforce development training and that skills training, that it's accompanied with some employment opportunities. And so we're really trying to partner with the private sector to figure out with agriculture in the north, how can we really start investing and bringing equity into building companies that will hire folks so that you train them. But if you put all your dollars into training them and you have people who have no jobs, then you have the same problem that I see with students in the United States who graduate with a master's degree and nobody to employ them because they didn't get the skills that they needed to move into the sectors. So the private sector role has to be a solution in terms of how we put these folks back into the workplace, that you can provide them with all the supports and all the health care and all of the job training, but if there's not an end route, then you don't have a solution that's sustainable, and you have something that's going to become increasingly dependent on NGOs that I think are, in many cases, creating a false dependence in communities that we shouldn't be. And so, on that note, rather than continue it, I think I'll conclude there and turn it back over to you, Hannah, to open it up for questions.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all three of you for your comments. I know that we'll have a good amount of time to dig into some of these issues in the Q&A. So with that, one moment. Yeah, so now I just want to open it up to the audience for the moderated Q&A. There are a lot of issues that have been raised. So before we start, I'm just going to outline a couple of the rules for engagement here. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and once acknowledged, we'll bring you the microphone. Please tell us your name and the organization, if any, with which you're affiliated. And if possible, identify the speaker to which you are directing your question. You'll have no more than 1 minute to ask your question, and then we'll proceed from there. So the Q&A session's open.
Hello, Dorothy Taft with the Market Project. We create trauma-informed market-based businesses to offer employment to men and women who've experienced trauma, exploitation, and human trafficking. We have a business in Gulu, currently employing about 35 people. My question for you is, what tools are out there that are actually measuring the impact that work has on reintegration and healing from trauma.
Thank you. All right. You have another question?
Hi, my name's Annalise. I'm a student at UC Berkeley. My question is more directed at Mr. Lezhnev, but I'm curious, how do you find it difficult to provide mental health services because there's a lack of doctors or a lack of psychiatrists or psychologists?
Great. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Asta Zinbo, and I work for USAID. And at a period of time, I was working for USAID in Democratic Republic of Congo with the UNICEF program, working in Eastern Congo. I just want to make one comment, is that they were very specific about not calling them child soldiers, but calling them children associated with armed groups, because of the fact that a lot of them were not voluntarily taken and not all of them were fighting. And in their reintegration centers, I mean, there are a number of girls that were sort of kidnapped to be the quote unquote wives. And so there's a whole other population set. And I think you alluded to the fact that there's like different identities, but I just wanted to make that comment. The second thing, as far as like two questions, I think one of, the strengths is that there are experienced groups about identifying them, coordinating with the armed groups, trying to remove them from that situation, moving them to a transit center, doing initial medical checks, trying to do some initial, training and other types of services. I think the weakness is with longer-term reintegration and longer-term following of some of these groups. There had been some comparison of programs in Colombia where, they follow them for 8-10 years, which many of these programs don't. Are you aware of any efforts to look longer term with sort of continuous efforts of reintegration? And then the second, because there was a mention sort of comparing that to work on domestic programs, but has there been any concerted effort to look at experience with reintegration of young people in gangs, street children, dealing with people affected with sexual and gender-based violence, and how much sort of specific kind of cross-learning has there been done?
Thank you. So we've got a couple questions here, and the first one I think probably any of you could answer, so I'll let you pick and choose, or if all three of you want to. But really looking at what tools can measure the impact and what is out there in that, kind of unpack that toolkit a little bit more for reintegration efforts. And then, Sasha, one directed specifically for you on some of the challenges that you face in providing mental health care, and whether it's purely infrastructure and capacity, or if there's other challenges that exist. And then the third question, really looking at the longer term, taking the longer view of reintegration, and you've all highlighted these long term is critical, and the conflicts are not short projects. And then looking at some of the lessons learned for reintegration and crossover between other sorts of trauma, particularly gangs, as we mentioned. So with that, Chidi, if you have comments, I'll let you start, and we'll head down the line.
So I will maybe touch on a little bit of each of the questions, not to take away from Sasha's question. I am not aware of tools or mechanisms that are measuring impact of the programs in healing from trauma. I think there's a lot of tangential data out there about how long we think it takes to sort of get a good idea of whether somebody has fully been rehabilitated or whether or not they've successfully gone through a process. But I'm not aware of any that has shown that concretely enough to be able to say this is a good example to use going forward. I think to maybe talk to the comment that the lady from USAID made, there is some data that's now coming out of the examples in South America, so Colombia specifically, because they've been a little bit out of their war longer than some of the wars we've seen in Africa. But again, it's just very tangential data at this point. On the question to Sasha, I will say just in the Nigeria context, having worked in Northeast Nigeria over the past year, there was one psychiatrist who was deployed to work with OCHA to sort of manage and help the DDR program. So I don't know what that says maybe about the infrastructure, the resources that are available to be able to deal with psychosocial issues. But let's just say, from my experience, the numbers are minimal when it comes to health professionals that can help with the mental and psychosocial issues of trauma from conflict. Are there efforts to look at long-term sort of cases down the road? I think so. I think that we're having to now, as I think this research is emerging, and we're starting to see more interest in understanding what happens to some of these child soldiers that we've talked about for so many years. People are starting to turn their focus to now what happens after, like the work that you're doing. So I think it's very crucial to understand, is any of this helping? Is it getting better? Is it improving? But having worked in the U.S. government, most of the work that I think was done was, as I said, in preventative care, but not necessarily looking at what it looks like down the road. And then I cannot necessarily talk to research on street children or people in gangs and gender-based violence and what that looks like as far as measurable evidence. I think there's a big gap when it comes to measurable evidence and data on whether or not some of these programs are effective, what is happening to these children afterwards, because I think we're turning to, if it's not dealing with the child soldier in getting them out of the situation, trying to rehabilitate them, we're now at the phase where we now have to start looking at what happens down the road. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, just a few things to add to what Chidi said. In terms of measuring impact of work on trauma, I think that I'm not aware of specific tools. I can just speak to our own experiences. I'd say a couple things that, first of all, because of the stigma issue, that a lot of these people are very isolated, or they become isolated when they come back to their communities. And so, the big challenge at the beginning is just to try to integrate them back into the local economy, the local society, et cetera, make them feel more welcome in all the kinds of institutions locally, right? So also, at least in northern Uganda, and this has got to be true for contexts where the child soldiers everywhere, or many places, most of the economy is informal, right? So the workforce is when you say that word, it makes me think of sort of Gulu town and the very specific kind of jobs that people would have, right? But in the rural communities where we operate, it's much more about sort of, local new businesses or community businesses and that kind of thing. And there, I think, again, like working in the groups is quite helpful. I would say that we deliberately work with these groups to try to help them create some social space to foster inclusion and a safe environment for these former child soldiers in order to not re-traumatize them. And so I think that's quite important. If somebody goes into like a job at an office or something, just as an individual, I can imagine that would be rather different. Right. Your question about providing psychosocial services. I think that, yes, of course, it's an enormous challenge. But that said, all the solutions are not from Western-trained doctors, right? That there are tons of local, there's far more local knowledge and capacity than we make out. I mean, I just raised that example of one psychiatrist in northern Uganda as just an example of the challenge, to highlight the challenge. But really, there's so many local elders, chiefs, leaders who are not necessarily named those things in the communities that really are the leaders, and we've learned a lot of that through working with these peer counselors in the communities. And so those people really are the front lines of help, and there's so much resilience, also so much more knowledge about actually how to deal with those child soldiers. A Western-trained doctor would have no idea, frankly, because they don't have that experience. So there's that. I just wanted to say one thing about the term child soldiers. We have the same thing in northern Uganda. We never, ever use the term child soldiers when in our projects in Uganda. We always say returnees, right? And at this point, when we're organizing our groups, we often ask people very much in private, like, were you formerly abducted? What was your experience? Blah, blah, blah. But like we don't even differentiate in the groups. We just need to have some of those people because of our programming mandate. But in fact, that terminology can be quite stigmatizing and traumatizing. We had a big fight about it at the beginning of our organization. Are we going to even use this term anywhere? And we just thought that, well, we have to communicate what we're doing to the outside world, so we will use it. But for the local context, yeah, we don't. So, go ahead.
Great. Great comments. I always, again, learn a lot when we're having these conversations. You know, Dorothy, I think to your point around the tools out there, I'm going to actually take a different angle on that. We have to be developing better tools to measure impact. Like, we should be doing it all. You know, one of the things that I've learned through the Global Livingston Institute, the greatest untapped resources is instead of having all of these universities sending kids over to volunteer and doing stuff, they should be helping us do this stuff. We should be measuring impact. And there's this whole concept of social impact that's out there right now. And everybody's talking about social impact, but what does that mean? And, you know, when we talk about it from the workforce development side, I tell people, you can hire 1,000 people. And there's this concept that if philanthropy puts $1 million, we hire thousands of people. That's not a social impact. You can hire 1,000 Ugandans, they'll be just as poor as they were when they started. If you exploit that labor and you don't use the resources well. And so we have to start measuring impact in terms of our programs, in terms of what does that mean? We have a team of 18 people down in at Intusi, which is our retreat center. One of the things we're doing this year is we're going to turn the mirror inward and find out, we pay them 30% better than anybody in the region. We provide them with health care. We engage their families. But are we having an impact? I don't know. Are they able to take care of their families? Are they sending their kids to school? Are they able to access health care when they get malaria? Those are things that we need to start being really critical of our own NGO approach to what we're doing in terms of how we measure it. So I appreciate your raising it, because anything that we're doing right now as we develop these programs, we should be figuring out how to measure the impact of those. This is great because I'm last, so I can just pick and choose what I answer and sound smarter. You know, in terms of longer term integration, we need to be paying attention to it. And Alice raised a great point. What we're starting to see in Lyra right now is, you know, the next phase of research for us is not looking at what's happening to the former child soldiers and how are they reintegrating in the community. We need to look at the former child soldiers' kids. And how are they reintegrating into the community? So you have a whole next generation of child soldiers' children, or former child, or whatever we refer to them as, that we've got to figure out, well, how disenfranchised are they? And if my dad or my mom is a former child soldier, do I integrate or fit into the community, and what resources and services do I need? And so I think it's another issue that we need to pay attention to as we start looking at longer term integration. And then the final point I want to make around the gangs thing, this is one I love spending time with Mandi talking about this, because this is where we've become so neo-colonial in our approach to Africa, I think sometimes, is that we kind of go over there to kind of figure out how we can inform those communities about how to reintegrate better into their communities. I think our homeless programs and our gang programs should be going to Africa and trying to figure out what we could learn from how they're reintegrating their people of conflict back into their communities. There's an enormous amount of information that I've learned over the last 10 years from Africa that's helped me do my work in Colorado better. And so as we look at these, I think that the point is hugely important, that we should be looking at what do we know and what do we understand about gang reintegration. But homelessness and gang reintegration should also be looking at what we've learned from all the information at the table here that could actually better inform our programs, so that these partnerships are more back and forth, and not just about what we can learn from Africa, but what can we share and what kind of information can we share with one another that would teach us how to run better programs, both in Africa and in the United States.
Great, thank you. All right, I'll take another round of questions.
Hi, Steffi Kaleo from the State Department's Bureau of Populations, Refugees, and Migration, focusing on the Great Lakes region of Africa. I was just wondering what kind of issues with documentation there are with child soldiers, especially for identification and family reunification, as well as what happens to children, if they are still children, when you can't really contact a family or identify a family.
I think we have a question in the back.
Hi, I'm Danny Rzuski with USAID. One comment and one question. The comment is previously when I was working in Mozambique, we came across a tool called the Connor Davidson Resilience Index Survey or something, CD Risk. So that's a tool that might be helpful if just something to think about and look at that could be adapted. The other question I have is you mentioned that most donors take a preventative approach. So how do we prove a counterfactual? Like, how do we show that what we're doing, stop people from going in, and how do we show that that's a successful approach?
All right, and then there was a lady in the very back row. I think it's hard to see, but someone in the very back row.
Hi, Kate Fisher from Feature Story News and CGTN Africa. Very, not a simple question, but simple for me. If you had a magic wand and one wish to try to solve this problem, what would it be? What's the one biggest thing that you would like to see change?
All right, I don't know if that would be a speaker's favorite question or least favorite question. It's very broad, but so let's start with the question about documentation and navigating that process, and ways to navigate if you can't find the family, or what that might look like. And then the second question is really looking at, Chidi really talked about prevention, and some of the weaknesses there and how to present other options and really maybe even come up with better approaches. And then the magic wand question, which I will leave open for all of you. So.
Maybe we start at the opposite end?
Yes, that's a great idea.
Oh, thanks a lot, Judy. I was looking really smart until now. I'm actually going to bat on the documentation issues outside of just saying that, this is where I think that the best way the way that we're connecting with them and addressing the documentation issues is identifying the local providers who understand how to connect them with their families way better than we possibly would. I think Sasha could probably maybe shed a little bit more light on that, but we have great providers there who understand how to do that locally. That's really helped us address those issues. Danny, thank you for the risk tool. We'll definitely look into that and see if there's ways that we can adopt that. I appreciate it. And then my favorite question is talking about the preventive approach. How do we change the way that people are doing things and not just showing up? I liken it to what we would do in Denver, Colorado, if a group of Ugandans showed up to go to one of our low-income communities to build a school because they heard that the education scores were low. It's like, well, that's not really what we need. But we do it all the time. We actually even bring stuff with us to build those things when it's like, well, some of that stuff is actually already in Africa. You don't need to bring it with you. And so, we do a lot. It was a really big stretch for one of our first university partners to say, hey, we're going to take a group of students on an immersion experience. And they said, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to build? We're not going to do any of those things. We're going to listen and we're going to think for 2 weeks. We're not going to fix Africa in 2 weeks. We haven't done it in 2 centuries. And so I think taking a different approach and really taking that hands-off approach and saying, hey, we talk about it, I said at the beginning, but we've inculcated in the West, don't just stand there, do something. And Africa is begging us right now, don't just do something, stand there. Get to know who we are and get to know the partnerships and get to know what we're about, and then figure out how you want to approach it. And when you have that education moment with your donors and you have those conversations, look at what Sasha's doing. Sasha didn't just show up and start doing those things. You get to know those communities and you figure those pieces out before you go do it. We've got to change that mentality, not just in Africa. We got to change it in our own community development that we do in the United States. But I think that if you can educate your donors around it, we have a tendency to gravitate to the quick fix. We want to fix things right away. We want to go in, we want to build something, we want to take a picture of it, we want to show everybody what we did, and we're good to go. And it is creating an enormous amount of damage, and it's creating an enormous amount of obstacles for former child soldiers and kids who want to reintegrate in their community, but the idea of looking at long-term integration, we have to look at long-term integration. That's where it's at. We get very excited about the momentary Band-Aid and disaster cowboys that come in. And it's like, well, what does that look like in 10 years? And are we building our programs to last? And so I appreciate that. And my magic wand is that. is that we change the way that people are thinking about Africa. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been very outspoken about how some of us in our own country think about Africa. And the images that we have portrayed need to be changed. That Africa is not a charity case. It doesn't need us to come and feel bad for them. It's not about rebel soldiers and people dying on the streets. There's people dying on the streets, and there's rebel soldiers all around the world. We've got to change the way that we're talking about Africa, and that we're thinking about it, and that we're approaching it. My magic wand is that we start building partnerships. The folks in Uganda or Mozambique or South Africa want to build partnerships, and we've got to change that approach.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. I'll start with the magic wand question first. That's the one that interested me the most, maybe. The one thing that I really like to see change is for the governments of these countries to be much more proactive about resolving these issues. In the 13 years that we've been working in northern Uganda, the government has done basically nothing about this issue. They talk about it from time to time. There's a big sort of ethnic divide between North and South in Uganda, which contributes, I think, to the lack of engagement. But really, it's the NGOs who are really resolving this issue, despite the fact that everyone's quite aware of the stigma and the trauma. And if you talk to people in Kampala about, do you think that people in northern Uganda face issues? Oh, yeah, it must be so bad. Are you going to do something about it? Oh, I don't know. That's what NGOs do. That's what you Mzungus do. And that, is really a shame. And so I know, certainly people from our projects say that, they vote 90% against the Museveni's party. So maybe that's why they don't want to service up there. But I think that's a big factor, and certainly it could be much more there. A couple of other things. What if you can't find the family members? So it's interesting that that's a kind of a two-sided coin. A lot of people don't want to go back to their families. Also, maybe they were forced to kill someone in their family, and so they don't want to face that, or for whatever reason. We often have found people who go to another community for that reason. We found that it's quite. And if they don't, or if they do go back to their community, and maybe a lot of their family were killed, then there is that larger community who were there. They share same last name, same dialect, that kind of thing. Also, these communities are rapidly changing, right? So, the people in northern Uganda were 90% displaced in many cases because the government had a policy to keep people in IDP camps. And then when the war in northern Uganda was over, people went somewhere else. You say went back to their communities. Well, those communities had shifted from, in some cases, 20 years in IDP camps, and so that landscape, it made our work as an NGO incredibly difficult, because all of a sudden our groups became, they spread out in different places. The members, had to travel 5 miles to meet, et cetera, et cetera. But I think regardless whether you're back together with your nuclear family or extended family, whether you're with your community or with a different community, each one presents its challenges and necessitates the creation of these sort of group project kind of things, where we're creating almost new communities through new local businesses and that kind of thing. And thanks also, Danny, for the tip about the CD risk. I will check that out.
Very quickly on the documentation question, very, very difficult. I remember working with a young child soldier who lived in Maiduguri, but all he could remember about where he was from was Coca-Cola, and that there was a stand that sold Coca-Cola in his village, and that was the one stand that sold Coca-Cola in the entire. So we're searching all of northeast Nigeria for what possible little community could have sold Coca-Cola only, to just find some entry points as to where he might be from in the northeast region. So documentation, very, very difficult, trying to find families, particularly depending on the age at which children were abducted or were kidnapped or left to go and fight. So I haven't found a good solution to that, and I don't think a lot of other organizations have either. I think I'll also go to the wand question, and maybe it'll hopefully tie into the preventative approach and whether or not it's been successful or not. But I would like to fix all of the other things that we think are wrong with Africa, or in other parts of the world as well. I mean, I would say the same for the United States, development, business, education. One of the great joys of working for the Obama administration was that he was very adamant that we focus on everything other than the problems, giving aid, security issues. Even when he had the African Leadership Forum, we were very upset that there was no security forum to talk to the African presidents about, but it was a very deliberate attempt to look at not the stigmas of Africa, but all of the other potentials of Africa. And I think to talk to the preventative question, USAID has a program that has been, I think, somewhat successful in Colombia called Partnership for Peace. And I remember a colleague calling me and asking if I would be a part of the Sahel version of this program for North Africa. And I said, you know, I don't have any countering violent extremist experience, thinking, of course, that that's the problem in the Sahel. And they were like, nope, we want to look at all the other problems that are surrounding. We want to look at programs. We want to look at education. We want to look at empowerment. We want to look at literacy rates. We want to try and fix all of the surrounding issues in an effort to try and curb, of course, the violent extremists challenge, the employment challenges, the economic challenges, and maybe some of the public services that are not being provided by the government at the local level. And so again, to your point about really investing in the local buy-in and getting into the local part of the problem will help alleviate, I think, some of the preventative. Will help some of the preventative approaches that we're looking at.
Thank you. All right, we can take one more round of 3 questions. So go ahead and keep your question limited to 1 minute. And first is the gentleman in the back.
Hi there. My name's Josh Nathan. I work with Bridge International Academies. We operate about 500 schools in the developing world, including about 60 in Uganda. I'm curious if you could speak for a moment to the question of education, and particularly primary school education that returnees might have missed. And whether you found in your research or your work that reintegration efforts that involve things like primary school literacy and numeracy are useful skills to impart to people who may be older than the typical student, but may have never gotten those opportunities in school when they should have.
All right, this lady in the 4th row.
Hi, my name is Cassandra Clark. I'm from the Department of State, Africa Bureau. I was just wondering if any of you all have any encouraging examples of South-South cooperation in this area. I mean, we have enough countries now that have dealt with this problem set in very different ways. I'm wondering if you have any positive examples or standout organizations or initiatives that you could share.
And did I see one more hand? Monty. No, you can't.
Sorry. I know you were trying to avoid calling on me. Manda Miangwa with the Africa program. Thank you so much to our speakers. I think just a number of things that I've picked up from all 3 of you. Wonderful presentations, by the way. Thank you very much. But just a few things to think about. One, what I think I hear you saying is, as we think about impact and success, I get the impression that we're very good about the quantitative aspect of impact, and that what we need to do is figure out how we can bring in the qualitative aspect of measuring that impact, so we have a more fuller understanding of just how well our programming is working. The second issue that I wanted to talk about that I didn't hear any of you talk about, you raised the issue of stigma, and that's important. I think in any number of African countries that I've traveled to, mental health issues are stigmatized. And even in this country, we're not very good about dealing with mental health, let's face it. And the problems become just even more complicated when you get to the African continent. So I do think that's an area in particular where I see not enough being done. The third issue that I would raise is, we do talk about that stigma, we acknowledge it exists, but I think one of the things we need to do is figuring out what informs that stigma. It's there, you cannot run away from it, but until we understand the various elements informing that stigma, it's very difficult to really find solutions that work. For one, I would say, here we tend to be very individually focused. In Africa, the community is everything. The family is everything. And if people understand that if the child soldier is coming back to the community, by definition, that entire family will become stigmatized. That is an issue. And so I think doing a little bit more unpacking around the issues that inform stigma. And then finally, you've all touched about how African governments need to do more on really elevating the importance and profile and responses to this issue. I agree with you. And so maybe we need to think about how do we elevate this issue. Say, the Mo Ibrahim Index on Governance is something that a lot of Africans respect. How do we raise it so that it becomes part and parcel of how we measure good governance on the African continent? How do we unpack the issue that's going on with the youth demographic in Africa? So we're not just lumping all youth together, but understanding the different segments of that youth demographic and what each of those segments needs, and then elevate that to the policy level so that the people who can actually inform and influence African governments to do more on this issue can actually do it. I know that was more than a minute, Hannah, but you can beat me up on me tomorrow. Thank you.
I can't say anything, yes, because you're my boss, but. Okay. Well, there's a lot of questions packed in there. So I will let each of you pick which ones you want to answer. And I'm just looking back at my notes here. So the first one is talking about education, primary school, and I think that's something you all touched on in different ways, how to offer that to returnees who come back older, obviously, and they missed that stage. And then second, if you have any examples of that South-South cooperation and some of those positive lessons learned that can be drawn on. And then Monday's question, I'll let you guys unpack that how you want, but she was looking at the impact and success, and I think, Jamie, you said is 50% on the data you mentioned of people who still feel unwelcome. And that kind of stood out in my mind, and how then you kind of measure that in a qualitative way. And then if you have any comments on the stigma and the nature of it, particularly in the African context, and how our approaches can be informed by that. And then the final rather broad question on elevating the issue and tying it into broader issues of youth on the continent, and also more response and buy-in from African governments. So Sasha, I'm going to mix it up and have you start first with any of those.
Do I get to
from
choose
there.
then who goes next? Is that
Yeah, go for it.
prerogative? I'm just kidding. So, yeah, sure. So, great question about the education. So, interestingly, in our projects, we started with more livelihood projects and trauma counseling projects, and then started to move on from there into microfinance and that kind of thing. And we were seeing some of the projects were failing, or they weren't succeeding as well as we had hoped, and so we started to sort of question and talk to the people, our participants, why, and then we slowly realized, well, a lot of them were just too afraid to tell us that they couldn't read and write, right? And so then we had to go back and we're like, oh, well, wait a minute. In order to do these livelihood or to go to the next step on microfinance, because there's, with savings and loan, you have to write down how much you loaned out, and, there's a whole written aspect to it. We had to go back and do literacy trainings for several of our groups, and then on the basis of that, then people were like, okay, great, now I can go back to school, or we have sort of a mini school training them in different things as well. So very, very important. And yeah, there is that challenge, of course, of adults going back in. Like we would deal with people who were 30 going back to like a second grade or something like that. So they were very stigmatized about that. But but at the same time, this is a place where 90% of people were displaced. The numbers of child soldiers are extremely high, so many, many people were also experiencing that same thing. Good question about South-South cooperation. I don't have particular organizations, but I remember that some folks from Sierra Leone came to Uganda to share some of their experiences, not just about this topic in particular, but more about sort of recovering from conflict overall, since their war ended previous to that in northern Uganda. There's also been something that we've fostered is group cooperation. Basically, so like we have some between 10 and 20 projects ongoing in different locations at the same time, and so we've fostered in some cases competitions among the groups. So to have them say like, okay, well you can do better than the next community on raising goats or something like that, and whoever wins gets a polo shirt. That was their prize of choice. But part of that was also you get to meet these other groups, and so they do joint activities together, and we found out to be pretty successful. People were really excited to just get out of the same place that they're in for all the time. And just lastly to Monday's question about or I guess it's more of a comment about working with the community. Absolutely, that is the number one. Our number one point of intervention is the local leadership. At the same time, the local leadership is dynamic. Oftentimes, at least in northern Uganda anyway, the elders or the chiefs are old men, and a lot of the youth don't necessarily respect them, or at least that's what they would say. And so we found initially we would go through them and they would help identify people or whatever, and then people would complain to us also that, well, this chief, just picked his cousins for your project, and that's ridiculous. So, you have to widen the scope. In fact, one of these chiefs ran away with some of our money. So then we had to expand to other parts of the community and identify youth leaders, and this is also part of the return process of going back home. But I'm going on too long. But in any case, I think that the identification of these peer counselors has been really helpful in that regard, because these are not necessarily elders or chiefs. These are people who feel like the local community respects them a bit, and they can add some people want to talk to them, they're counselors, so that adds a little bit of a new leadership element. Great. Jamie.
Wow, great. Josh, you're right on the school piece. We've got to start rethinking education. You start looking at these child soldiers, or the former child soldiers coming back in their community. K through 12 education is not realistic. We've got to be partnering with folks like you who understand it, who've built institutions that understand the tenets of it, and figure out what are those basic skills that they're going to need. You've got a 20-year-old where if we can get him or her into the workplace, what are the basic skills that an organization like yours could provide them that are going to provide them with the information? They don't have 12 years to go through the school that they missed to get them back up to speed. So what are the ways that we can repackage education that's going to get these young people the skills that they need to reintegrate into jobs that will actually provide them with a sustainable living? So it's a great point and deserves a lot of attention as we address these things. I think I'm probably going to yield to you on the collaboration response. Our work has been very, very focused in Uganda around it, but I do want to spend a little bit more time on some of Monday's comments, especially because she was my fellowship advisor, so I don't want to get in trouble by not responding. But I want to talk about the Africa government piece is an interesting thing, just because as the governments are struggling or difficult to deal with, I do believe that we still have an obligation to figure out how to build those partnerships and how to leverage those partnerships. And we have a music festival right now that we've grown over the last 4 years. That this year we had 44,000 Ugandans in rural communities come to our music festival. We tested over 8,000 Ugandans for HIV. 100% of them are in treatment and services right now, and we provided over 2,000 women with cervical cancer screening. That happened not because the GLI is great and we did really cool things. It happened because our local health providers that are funded by the government came and said, if you're going to do this music fest, what would happen if we went and provided some of those healthcare services we've got at your event? That we've got this great partnership with the local community. And I think that the more we can leverage, engage partnerships with local government, and rethink those partnerships and rethink the role that that we develop with them, I think is really important. That if we're building programs, if we're not looking at local government, if we're not looking at ways that we can leverage those partnerships, there's definitely an enormous amount of reasons to say that it's difficult to do, but I don't think it precludes that we should be having those conversations. And then, I want to talk about the stigma thing because it's really important. I think it's important that we unpack it in the communities, and so that's why we're kind of not just going to the child soldiers and saying, well, tell us what your perceptions are, but we're going to local community and telling us, well, what are your perceptions of who these young people are, so we can better understand those issues. And stigma is addressed when we educate people to understand the issues better. And I think that we need to address the stigma locally. But again, I'm going to make my audacious comments. We've got to address the stigma internationally. It's very clear over the last 2 weeks that not everybody in this country understands what Africa is or what it looks like. And there's a stigma that's associated all the way at the top leadership in our country. And we've got to change the way people think about it. And you've got to unpack it to figure out, why do we think that? Every year when we take students over to Rwanda, I get parents that call me and ask me if their kid's going to be safe because there's a genocide. I was like, the genocide was 25 years ago. And we've got to unpack that stigma because these are well-educated, very informed people who, one, talk about Africa like it's a country, and two, have not unpacked their own stigmas, and they have access to some of the best education on the planet. So if we're not doing it here, then how do we do it in those communities in the countries? And I think the research that folks are doing, and the folks who are sitting at this table are doing, and the people in this audience are doing, I know a lot of you are doing amazing work in Africa. We've got to figure out how to start unpacking those stigmas and understanding them better so we can change the way that we're addressing those populations. So I think it's a great question.
Thank you. Chidi?
Well, I will be very quick on the education comment. I would say that it depends on the age group. I think you gave a great example of a 20-year-old woman who needs to go into the workforce immediately. Her needs right now are not learning ABCs. It's providing for her family or whatever she's come out of in the conflict of being reintegrated. And so adapting or calibrating your response and your education and literacy response to meeting those needs is what I've experienced in working as to the advantages of having education and literacy. And somebody asked about positive initiatives and encouraging examples. The South example. I think this has worked a little bit in Uganda. I saw, at least between the South Sudanese and the Ugandans on the border, where they were able to discuss similar examples of being child soldiers. It also, in a sense, somewhat backfired a little bit in that they had such a solidarity that they kind of reverted back to memories of when we were, which was not what we were going for at the time. But it did at least provide a community where they could talk about some of the challenges and issues that they had together, and we were able to pull examples from that. I would say also that the Dallaire House in Canada, which works on legal issues of child soldiers and child soldier reintegration, has a lot of good examples that they've brought, I think, from not just from Africa, but also from Europe on how that has worked well. Dr. Muyangwa, you are spot on the stigmas. I think at the community level, one of the examples that has always been so stark has been the use of rape as a weapon of war in the Congo. It takes, one rape of a man to be able to completely stigmatize an entire community and ostracize him from being able to do anything, and his family from being able to do anything, because there are beliefs about there being, supernatural powers or whatever that happens when this action takes place. Getting past those stigmas and getting past some of those cultural issues is definitely going to be a challenge. But I think, Jimmy, you're very right that it starts with those communities, and it starts with getting past that first before we go and impose ideas about how to get rid of those stigmas. We need to understand that cultural context and what it means to the community to be able to try and get past some of those. I'll quickly just stay on the raising the governance and the government responsibility at the policy level. Having worked for the U.S. government, I don't always agree that we did it the right way. And Cassandra, you can, since we worked very closely on some of these issues, I think we used to do a lot of punitive measures. If you don't do what we say, we're going to take this away. If you don't do what we believe. Whereas I think the the buy-in and the political will has got to come from the government understanding the advantages of not having these type of issues in their country. Development can be positive for the country. Having an educated workforce, having an educated society can be advantageous, but it's also getting them to understand that from their own perspective, not because it's being imposed on them. So that is a hurdle, and I think if we start to take away maybe some of always the punitive and get to more of a collaborative relationship with some of these countries, you will definitely see more responsive behavior on the behalf of the governments and their ability to be able to impose that upon their citizens. So I will leave it at that. And yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for your comments and for your insightful questions. This was a really rich discussion. There was a lot of expertise here, and both from you and your questions, and also our panelists. So I want to thank you for engaging. A lot of issues were raised. A couple, among other issues, a couple themes came to the top. One of those was just the need for holistic and integrative solutions that are not siloed efforts. And another point that I thought was really key was evaluating the changing nature of conflict and really understanding specific experiences in specific contexts. And then one final issue, which was raised multiple times, was the importance of listening and evaluating community needs and acting upon them. What does the community need? What does it want? And making that really foremost in efforts. And then also a final challenge to both U.S., international actors, and African governments to do more and to consider some of these practices in their efforts. So with that, I just want to thank you all for coming and join me in thanking our speakers.